Thank you, Lisa. A couple of thank yous just to kick us off. Thank you to all of you for spending a spectacular August evening inside. We promise not to keep you inside too long, but it means a lot to have you come out. Also, thank you to Rainey Bench and Willie Granston and Louis Miller and Martha Donovan and Carrie Donovan for reasons that will become clear later. But whenever you're pulling together these sorts of talks, and, Willie had asked me, seems like 5 years ago now, but it definitely was not, following an exhibit across the street at the Maritime Museum when they were putting this issue of tobacco together, if I would be interested in writing about Lucy McMullen Dodge, because I have a particular side interest, if you will, in 19th century Maine women photographers. Turn of the century Maine women photographers. So I gratefully took on the assignment, got lost in the research with a lot of help along the way. So I'm only able to put together what I can do in addition to my own research built on what Willie and Martha and Carrie had put together while researching the exhibit of Lucy's work that was across the street a few summers ago. So my thanks for that. The talk tonight will kind of work in 3 concentric circles that will maybe come together at the end. One, we'll situate ourselves on the rock. Then we'll talk about Lucy McMullen Dodge and how we know what we know, and look at her photographs and her work. And then at the end, hopefully there's time. Well, there'll definitely be time for questions. I really edited myself on slides. I'm a visual historian, so I'm like, everyone needs to see 300 images. You don't. If you want to, there's more digitized online at the museum, which you can look at to your heart's content. But I do want to contextualize her work for you in the larger context of other women photographing in Maine in this time period. And one of the interesting things I've been finding lately, I live in Gorham, Maine. I teach at USM in Portland. I run a map library. There is one map in this presentation. I am morally obligated to do that with my other job, but we have 500,000 maps dating back to 1475. It's a spectacular collection. I welcome you all down to Portland to come and see it. If you can't come see it, oshermaps.org, 90,000 of them are on there for you to enjoy. Done with my promo, but it's a pretty amazing place. But even the lighthouse maps, and you'll see one of them in a minute, really help contextualize the remote nature of this work. And what I hope you walk away with is this sense of the continuing difficulties of women's history, to be honest. Like recovering the lived life of a late 19th and early 20th century woman, Lucy McMullen Dodge, who had a public career. She was a school teacher. She was a lighthouse keeper's wife. Because she appears in the record in this way, and because she took these photographs, we can reconstruct her life, but with great difficulty and painstaking research. And I think for me, a lot of what I've been thinking about as an historian and a public historian, but also, as been working for a long time, as a working mother, as someone who tries to balance my own work and my life and my labor, the difficulties that go into all of this and how hard it still is to find the stories of women. And an interesting thing, and we'll talk about this more at the end, but there is something about maritime museums and women's glass plate negatives that's really starting to emerge as a pattern, not just across the street, but the Maine Maritime Museum in Bath, if you get down there this summer, has a spectacular exhibit, I think up through November, of 19th and 20th century women photographers from their collections. The Penobscot Marine Museum in Searsport, which is another phenomenal museum, they have one of the largest photo collections in Maine, almost 150,000 plus images. They have some wonderful collections of 19th and early 20th century women's work. But women adjacent to men in the maritime industry, sea captains' daughters, lighthouse keepers' wives, shipbuilders' daughters and wives, take up photography to a kind of interesting and remarkable extent. And starting to connect the dots on that has been really, really interesting. So thanks to everyone who does the work to make these events possible. Thank you to Northeast Harbor Library for this gorgeous room and all of the help with setup this morning and this evening. And thanks to folks who digitize these images and put them online, because without that work, this work is really difficult. And the more and more these images are shared and put into the public, the more and more collections scholars and students can really make. So this is a very typical quote about Mount Desert Rock in the 19th century. And I will read it because it makes me laugh. Mount Desert Rock is the farthest land on which a New England coast lighthouse shows its warning light in the window. Its great tower is too distant to be seen from the island, as 6 or 7 leagues of water roll between. But I warrant that not a few of my readers have seen it by night or by day, a strange sight indeed, in a strange place, rising about the waves like the last monument of some buried city of antediluvian times. Here now is a spot where the terrors, the solitude of ocean might well appall the stoutest heart. What is it but a prison, a walled-up dungeon, a horrible solitude, a bare rock drenched by every gale, holds the light tower high above the waves, drenched indeed. And Samuel Adams drank, a little bit romantic in his writing in 1891, checks out. But a prison, a horrible solitude, a dungeon. This is very typical of the writing about Mount Desert Rock, not by people who lived there, by people who saw it from afar, but not even really by people who visited. This is the writing about the rock that persists in the written record. And I think in many ways, Lucy Dodge's images counter that narrative. Otherwise, she and her husband and the other 2 keepers' families who stayed together for almost a decade on this rock, I don't think could have done it. But they're not lying about the bare rock drenched by every gale. And I think the aerial view is really worth looking at here. This is a 1950 aerial taken by the Coast Guard, who of course would have been responsible for the lighthouse once it was automated. It's 25 nautical miles southeast, 21 miles at the entrance to Frenchman's Bay. And so I do want you to keep this image in the back of your head as you imagine living here, not just for a night or 2, but for 12 months, year after year after year, as the keepers and their families did. This is my morally obligated map. This is a 1906, actually really interesting map of the first lighthouse district. So the lighthouse on the rock, which was established by Congress in 1829, built in 1830. We don't have any pictures of the 1830 version, really. It predated photography for one, but also was a wooden cottage with a lantern on a roof. It was not high enough. It was not effective as a lighthouse. And it was replaced in 1847 with a 58-foot granite tower that was designed by the architect Alexander Paris. And it is part of the first lighthouse district. So if you look at the first lighthouse district, which is primarily the East Coast of the United States, and this is a map from our collections at Osher, there's a whole set of lighthouse district maps that were printed in 1906 by the federal government. But I just want to show you how off the map it really is. You sort of look at the tip of MDI up at the top of your screen, like look at Bass Harbor Light just for, and then look down to the very edge of the map and you see that dot of a lighthouse and a kind of postcard from right about the time period when they would have lived there. Before the Paris Lighthouse was built in 1847, a kind of visitor for the federal government, I.W.P. Lewis, wrote another really interesting contextual piece just to get you really situated into what this living was like in the 1840s. By the early 1900s, we had gotten a little better. but it doesn't take away from the danger of the location, because time and tide continue on despite what you build there. The location is the most dangerous of the whole lighthouse establishment. A line rock in the open ocean, only 15 feet above tide level, and its entire surface swept over by the surf and storms, the force of which may be estimated by the fact of large masses of rock being moved from place to place by the fury of the sea dashing against them. And in fact, Lucy would take some photos of broken rocks after storms. A pile of these are heaped up in front of the keeper's house, and were it not for protection afforded by this natural breakwater, the house and its inmates, here's the prison again, the house and its inmates would long since have been swept away. The light is a very important one. The rock on which it stands is 12 miles from nearest land, a little farther, and has been the scene of many fearful disasters. The feebleness of the light may be imagined when it is known that the brig Billow of Boston was wrecked there a few years since. Mount Desert Rock, as one of the exterior coast lights, is of great value to warn vessels of their approach to the shore or main, and should therefore be distinguished by its intense brilliancy and peculiar character from all others. In its present state, it's of little utility. 24 lamps are required here for a fixed light. And that was part of the move to get a more sophisticated lens system in the lighthouse, which they did and continue to do. So if you're reading this, as I initially was when I was writing this piece for Chabaco, okay, I've got to understand the rock, I've got to understand Lucy, I have to understand the context in which she's working. I was like, this is a terrible place to be. But these photographs do not match these written descriptions written by folks who did not, in fact, live there. This is the National Archives has a lot of the lighthouse records. So this is in 1847. So if you want to imagine it, not too far from when Lewis was visiting, but when you can see the new Alexander Paris Tower up there. So you can see the original keeper's house that is changed. You've got a bell tower, you've got the original stone dwelling, and you have the boathouse, which is visible. By 1876, they had added a new keeper's dwelling. You can see that here. They replaced that again in 1893, with a double keeper's quarters. And that double keeper's quarters, you're gonna see in a lot of Lucy's photographs. So this is a great picture, also in the National Archives, also a kind of record of the Lighthouse Board, where you have kind of everyone living on the island, including the children, out in front of the new house. And so this research, which I really want to credit Martha and Carrie and Willie for when they put this exhibit together, really talks about the fact that there were 3 families on the rock when Lucy Dodge and her husband Will were living there. And so the principal keeper was Fred Robbins and his wife Lillian. They came in 1898. They lived in the other half of the double house. Fred was the second assistant keeper, but he kind of worked his way up to first assistant and then principal keeper in short time. And he stayed principal keeper from 1902 to 1911. The first assistant was Charles Newman and his wife Alberta. They had 3 children, Arthur and Lawrence and Charlie. Charlie was born during their time on the rock. He was born in 1905. I want to imagine that he was not born on the rock, but we could find out. The Newman family came from Southwest Harbor. They lived in the single tenement. They moved on to Monhegan after, as did the Dodges for a little while. They went to Sabine Light too. And then you have the second assistant keeper, William H.C. Dodge, with his wife Lucy, and their nephew, Casper Murphy, who they raised with a son. They lived together. They came to the Rock in 1902. They lived in the other half of the double home, and they stayed until 1909. So when you look at the records of keepers, you can see a lot of people spent like a year or 2 on the Rock, at most. This is a really interesting period in the Rock and the Lighthouse's history, where you have these three families living together for 6 to 9 years. It tells me that they enjoyed each other and that they could live together and that they formed a really tight-knit, close community, because there was no shortage of lighthouses for these men to keep on the coast of Maine. And they're often bouncing around. I just imagine the Dodges, Swinlight is pretty remote as well, where they went after. Monhegan must have seemed like New York City, but the Robinsons went there after. So they had been living, by the time the Dodge family gets there, there had been keepers and their families living on the rock for about 80 years. And one of the things that really makes their time unique are these images that Lucy made. Sometime in the winter of 1906, we don't know why necessarily, but we have some clues. She decided to take up photography, and over the course of the next 3 seasons, 06, 07, 07, 08, 08, 09, she actively photographed life on the rock. The glass plate negatives from her camera now reside across the street, but what's really cool is that Willie brought them over, and we can't take them out of the box, but you can see the boxes of the original glass plate negatives in the wooden nailed box that they were kept in. I was telling Willie when he showed these to me, I was so nerded out over seeing them. These, when you look at old glass plate negative boxes, they're usually torn and dirty. These are pristine. Imagine their life. They left wherever they were shipped from, had to get 25 nautical miles to Mount Desert Rock, taken there, developed there, and then when they left, must have gone from lighthouse to lighthouse to lighthouse with the family, and then finally ended up with her nephew at the end of his life is when they made their way across the street. So she's really careful with her work, and you'll see a lot of this. So she took more than 100 images that we have. This doesn't count the broken ones. This is the box we have. There could be more, who knows? But we get a really detailed window into the otherwise really insular worlds of the 3 families who lived together on the rock. They also, I would argue, really serve as this visual archive of the lighthouse keeper's life at a time when the written archive of these, remembrances by lighthouse keepers' wives are really scarce. So we can track her life in census records, in marriage record. There's a couple of lines about her comings and goings in local newspapers. But when we corroborate her images with records of other women and families who lived in remote lighthouses in Maine and New England, and also Michigan. Michigan has so many lighthouses. There's a lot of women who write about their experiences there too. We can get a fuller sense about the daily lives of those who chose to live on the literal edge of the world, while they provided a really essential civil service to mariners and the shipping industry. So we can experience life through her images in a way that's really no longer possible. And I think her images really provide this visual counter narrative, right? Prison, dungeon, remote, isolated, place where no one would want to go, medieval, the loneliest of all lighthouses, a place where few persons, quote, would willingly choose for their permanent abode. But Dodge's images give us a very different view of life on the rock. It is an active and peopled place. Families worked together to run the lighthouse and the foghorn. Children played, flowers and gardens grew with a lot of work. Family, friends, and fishermen visited constantly. And this is the other point to take away. There's a lot of narratives, even throughout, the 1910s and into the 1920s, with national publications saying, oh, when the lighthouse brig, like the supply ship, comes twice a year, and that's the only time they ever see anyone. No, their families are coming out constantly. They're leaving from Southwest Harbor. They're sending nieces and nephews out. Kids are sleeping over on the island for like 3 to 6 weeks with their cousins. And you get a lot of fishermen coming and going. You get people bringing out mail and supplies. The lighthouse keepers could leave as long as other ones were there. They could run into town for supplies, and you would see that each family took like a 2 to 3 week vacation from the Rock every summer, where they were home with their families, usually somewhere on MDI. And so it's really interesting. There's a great book called Women Who Kept the Lights. And the authors that remind us that the written record is far more complete regarding the construction and maintenance of the light stations, because every light station had to publish an annual report. So we know what happened. We know when they saved people. We know how much oil they would have used. We know when they automated the lights. We know about the building construction. But there were inspectors that came and visited. But the lives of lighthouse keepers and their personal histories, we only really get from their appointment records or from census data, through their obituaries. If there's a dramatic episode in a terrible shipwreck, or if they had an unusually long career like Will Dodge did. And this is really true of those families who were on the Rock together, and conveyed through Lucy Dodge's negatives and the handwritten notes that she recorded on each paper sleeve. And it's why they're so important. What we know of Lucy come from local Hancock County newspapers and census records. She's born Lucy Mariah Mullen on June the 3rd, 1864 in Tremont, Maine, right on the southwesterly side. On the 1870 census, she's listed as the youngest of 4 children. She has 2 brothers, Frank and Justin, and a sister, May. Her father, Francis, was a shipmaster. Her mother, Mary, is listed as keeping house, as many women would have been listed in that time period. Frank was at home, and the 3 younger siblings were shown on the census as at school. 10 years later, she's still listed in school. Frank was a sailor. Her elder sister, May, had become a school teacher. And their name changes in Tremont. They're sometimes the McMullens, and then in 1880, they're the Mac-Mullens. We don't know exactly how they spelled their name. When she was 16 and she finished her secondary education, Tremont was bustling. It had a population of over 2,000. It had 2 churches, and it had 13 schoolhouses. It needed a lot. Tremont had 13 schoolhouses, which needed a lot of teachers, right? And that's just Tremont. There were dozens upon dozens of schoolhouses on the island. It had a sawmill, a gristmill, a brickyard, a boat builder shop, a canning factory, and a fish curing establishment. People worked on the sea. And so Lucy came of age in this place where the daily goings of maritime life have been really familiar to her. It's also clear by the mid-1880s that both Southwest Harbor and Mount Desert Rock were something of a tourist attraction. Clara Barnes Martin wrote an 1885 guidebook called Mount Desert on the coast of Maine, and she writes about going to the Rock. But the special claim of Southwest Harbor upon the tourist lies in the attractions of the sound and the ocean itself. The many islands lying within easy distance afford great variety of interest for yachting parties, still going on today. Saw a lot of yachts parked in Bar Harbor last night. The winds are steadier than in Frenchman's Bay, making sailing less hazardous and plans for picnics less uncertain. This is the best point from which to undertake the trip to Mount Desert Rock. Throughout the summer, there is constant communication with the lightkeeper, and for parties who can wait for clear weather, the trip can be easily arranged. Constant communication with the lightkeeper for people who want to go out and have picnics. These are not people seeing a supply boat twice a year, not in the summertime. We find her in the record again in 1893 when she was 29 and she had become a teacher. There is mention of her in the Bar Harbor record in the Bass Harbor section, where the editor records that Lucy Mullen has returned home to South Poolsboro, where she has been teaching. Later that year, the editor noted the school of this place closed last Friday. The scholars gave a fine exhibition on the last afternoon, which shows the labor of the teacher was not in vain. Miss Mullen of Bar Harbor was the efficient teacher. Her record of marriage from December of 1893 says she married William H. Dodge in Tremont on the 7th of December. She was 29. He was older. She was listed as a school teacher on her marriage record. and he was listed as a mariner. We know that she continues teaching in Tremont, the District 9 schoolhouse, after her marriage. Women could continue teaching after they were married. They could not if they had children. That persisted in Maine like through the 1940s. So married women could teach, mothers could not. So it's likely that she continued teaching school throughout the 1890s. We find them again in 1902, when William gets his first appointment from the lighthouse, sending them to Mount Desert Rock as the second assistant keeper. So when they first go there, they meet the Robbins family, Fred and Lillian, and he moves on to Vinyl Haven after that. Charles Newman and Alberta and their 3 children are there. And so for a time, there are 3 keepers. So we're 6 adults, 4 children, sometimes 5 to 10 children, if nieces and nephews came for the season, if they often did. The Ellsworth American is helpful. It tells us a lot about what's going on the Rock. But there's a great letter in January of 1903 that Mrs. R.E. Newman writes. And you have to imagine that she is related to Charles Newman, the first assistant keeper. And she writes this lengthy letter to the editor. I will not read it all, but I will read some because she's funny. And she's trying to dispel all of these falsehoods about life on the Rock. So she's reading probably the Snow piece and others that I read to you, and she's like, no. People who do not know anything about the Rock think it is a terrible place. But for the last 30 years, some of my relatives or near neighbors have been living there. So you see, I am not without some knowledge about their ways and means. All of our fishing boats and vessels fish near the Rock, and they always bring some word to the people there. She wanted to tell readers that families were not totally disconnected from life, and they didn't go months at a time without reprieve. Each man has a 10 days leave at the first of each month to go to his home. He mails the papers from the station to the government and waits for the returns. He also gets supply of needed provisions for the next month. They have always kept up this system of coming here to Southwest Harbor or Bass Harbor every month until the last winter. Then, after January, they hired a sloop from Bass Harbor to go to them and carry them such things as needed and the mail, and take their orders from next month, and glass plates, which I'm adding, because clearly she had those delivered. This winter, they hired a sloop from Southwest Harbor. As to their not seeing anyone only when the light tender calls, that is as big a mistake as all the rest. For there is not a week throughout the summer that there is not company for one or the other keepers, and quite often through the winter. Very often when the St. John's steamers pass, they throw boxes of fruit and bundles of paper overboard for the keepers, and they go off and get them. I just love that. The steamers coming from Canada are like throwing bananas overboard as they're going to get them. So you really get a sense. She's so snippy, Mrs. Newman. But you feel like, okay, this is not an isolated prison dungeon, and they're seeing people weekly. It's true that the lighthouse ward tenders came in frequently. They came like twice a year, if you were lucky. But that was not their only contact. She says, altogether, there are many worse places than Mount Desert Rock. If you leave tonight knowing nothing besides that, we've had our victory. So they really worried about you, and you can imagine, and I'm sure if you live up here all year, your family worries about you in January too. So January, you get a lot of news stories, like, are they all right? Are they out there? Are they still out there? So there's a little country notes section in January of 1908 by the regional correspondent who went by the pen name Spray. Much sympathy is felt in the winter season for the isolation and loneliness of the keepers of the lights along our coast on Seagirt Isles. I'm sure Mrs. Newman is like incensed whenever she reads these articles. And yet, in many instances, they are as happy and content in their little kingdoms as though they were in the swim of public festivities. Fred Robbins of Mount Desert Light Station is an enterprising cabinet maker and boat builder. His wife Lillian takes much comfort with her camera, and many of her friends are grateful for her specimens of her skill. The correspondent received from her last week 2 fine photographs, 8 by 10 inches, one of her home, the tower and the house, the other a lovely sea view, both clear and excellent in finish. Mrs. Robbins' niece, Frances Harmon, is spending the winter with her. Now we're getting somewhere. We know that Lillian Robbins, we don't have any photos. Please, someone in the audience have Lillian Robbins' photos and tell us after. I'm counting on you. But we don't have any of Lillian Robbins' photos. But we know she was taking pictures. But more importantly, this article also tells us that she was developing them and printing them on the island. And so was Lucy. We know that the Robbinses and the Dodges lived together. They shared the two family keepers' residence. The Newman family were in the single residence, who was head keeper. Maybe Lucy starts photographing because Lillian does. But they're not just taking glass plate pictures. And they're not just taking 4x5s. If she's taking 8x10s, it's a whole other thing. But if they're sending photographs back as like proof of love, which they may very well be, then we're getting somewhere. So I don't want you to think that photography, I mean, it becomes really widespread in the 1920s and 1930s, but it wasn't an unusual hobby for women, particularly middle-class women at the turn of the century. So I love bringing Frances Benjamin Johnston in here. One, so you can see her amazing self-portrait from 1896. But two, you cannot give a talk, it's like not allowed to give a talk about turn of the century women photographers without mentioning her. Because she publishes this article in Ladies' Home Journal in 1897 called What a Woman Can Do with a Camera. And it's this article that is the touchstone to understanding the history of women photographers in the United States. She's primarily writing to women who want to make photography their profession, but she gives instructions about purchasing equipment, setting up a proper darkroom, seeking training, composing artful images. She says most dealers in photographic supplies present neat little books of instruction with the cameras they sell. Well, every box of standard brand plates contains printed slips of well-tried formulae. Those are boxes of standard plates. In general, one may advise the beginner to be exact, infinitely careful in the matter of details and in carrying out instructions intelligently and to the letter. As Lucy did, she keeps notes on envelopes that the plates live in about what developer she's using, how long she exposed things. She recommends that the ideal outfit for an all-around outdoor and indoor work would be a 6.5 by 8.5 inch or 8 by 10 inch camera, light and weight, compact and simple in construction, easy to carry, easy to use, easy to keep in order, a light but rigid tripod, and a few extra plate holders. This was the most widely circulated women's magazine in America. Women read this article, and it's likely it gives us a good idea of the kind of equipment that Lucy Dodge and Lillian Robbins would have had. So I also want to just show you two Kodak advertisements. They're advertising. This is 1909, 1911. This is when they're still on the rock. These are marketing to women, to every outdoor hobby, to every delight of nature, to the very spirit of spring itself. There is an added charm for those who Kodak. And there's a woman photographer. There's a woman photographer on the farm. All the outdoors invites your Kodak. Every day there are pictures right at home that are worth the taking. Pictures of the family that will always be cherished. Pictures of stock and props and buildings that will always be of interest and value. So what they're doing on the rock is just this, which was not unusual at the time. What's unusual is that we have them, right? That they've persisted, that they're not in a family album. Here's more advertisements from the same period. I just want you to see the type of cameras that they're using. So these are 4x5 glass plate. You know, you would put the plate in the holder, slide the holder into the back of the camera, expose the image, take the holder out, develop the plate, etc. But they're always showing women. These are what the boxes of plates look like. They would have come just stacked in glass. That's what you see right over there. So we know that she was shooting with 4x5 plates. They're thin sheets of pre-sensitized glass. They have a layer of silver gelatin emulsion that the manufacturer puts on. These are the most popular from the 1880s to the 1920s. By the 1920s, roll film is what people want, right? It's much more widely available and preferred. The plates are 4x5, 5x8, or 8x10. And this is the crazy thing about photography on the rock and these boxes. If you wanted these dry plates to work, they had to be kept dry and out of the light. I don't, like, literally there are stories of waves that are dozens of feet high, like washing away half the rock. But meanwhile, those things stay dry in that airtight wooden box. You had to keep them out of the light. You had to develop the negatives in a dark room. I would imagine it's quite dark on the rock, so probably every room was a dark room. But you can imagine, like, you had to keep these dry and safe. Also, it's a 20-mile journey from the mainland, getting these things even out there. Lucy and Lillian would have had to contend with wind and waves, sea spray, unsteady surfaces. Any one of those things could spoil an image. This is a process wholly dependent on natural light. They would have had to wait for calmer, clear days. My son, who's 11, has been loving photographing all over the island. But you know, he has his Polaroids didn't come out right last night because the light was weird, right? And you need light. So they had to wait for these good days. So it's telling that she starts in the winter. It would have been a welcome distraction to break up the monotony of the long, cold winter weeks. And one of her very first images is a snow-covered granite ledge. This is winter on the rock. But also, if you're just starting, snow's great because it's so light, right? You can really capture that contrast. She's taking this from the back door of the double tenement, and I think that's the door frame in the very top of the image. And you can see the surf pounding the shore. The other great thing that she does is she puts each plate in an envelope, labels it with the date, says what it is, where it was taken, and signs it Ellen Dodge. So how do we know? This is how we know. Most of what she's taking is outside in direct sunlight. So here is a shot from August of 1907. This is the double house where the Dodges and Robinsons lived. That is her nephew, Casper, standing right outside amongst the rocks. And that is her husband, Bill, sitting on their front porch. And you get the sense, I mean, some of her images are a little bit overexposed. She's learning, but you're almost always seeing the light. What's really interesting is that Casper is a key to this story. I don't think the Dodges could have children of their own, or they chose not to. But they did take him in as a young child, and he was with them in almost every census, wherever they went. He became a boat builder and a mariner. But before he died in 1984, Bill Caldwell interviewed him for a book called Lighthouses of Maine. And he has this wonderful reminiscence of his aunt and uncle. When he was 6 years old, he joined them in 1904. And he recalled that his family, quote, shared a two-family house with the keeper, Fred Robbins. The first assistant keeper in his family had a house of their own. I used to play with his boys, Arthur Newman 5 and Lawrence Newman 4. This is before Charlie was born. We played in the fog bell tower, played boats on Herring Puddle, walked on stilts, I can't even imagine, and tried to play croquet on the volcanic rock. And Casper warmly recalls that his aunt, quote, schooled me every day on the rock for hours. Then at later stations too, she taught me reading, writing, grammar, and history. This was the only formal education, besides the technical education he received from his uncle and the other keepers, that he ever received. If she was schooling him, you can imagine that the Newman boys were there too, right? And she had been trained as a school teacher and worked as a school teacher. And here you can see Arthur Newman, the son of the first assistant lightkeeper, and Charles Newman and Casper Murphy. So you can see the kids out on the rock. This is also from August of 1907. And this gives you a really good sense of the double house and its proximity to the light, right? And the boathouse and the fog bell. And here's another, I love this image. She takes both landscape and portrait images, which not all glass plate cameras could do. You couldn't flip the plate holders in all of them. That really only comes out in the 1900s. And so you can see developed with Dianol, right? She's writing that part on the bottom. We have 2 interiors, soon to be 3, because Willie's having another one scanned that hadn't been scanned. And I wanted to spend a second on these interiors because they're really important. It's hard to take pictures inside. That's why you don't have a lot of interiors before the flash. So she waits for these super bright sunny days. And we have these 2 interiors, one of Casper's room and one of the sitting room in the North House where the Newmans lived. They were both shot in the late summer of 1907. I think she's experimenting. This is Casper's bedroom, which is immaculate. Whitewashed walls, a white lace coverlet, decorative flags, a wooden chair, there's a small stuffed horse in between the chair and the bed. The sun shines so brightly into this bedroom that you need both curtains and a shade. A very healthy geranium. Look at that, geranium's healthy. It sits on that windowsill. It's something green and colorful on a treeless island. On the shelf, there's a toy rifle, flags, a spyglass, and the Youth's Companion Minuteman calendar for 1906. These would have been a welcome connection. The Casper also tells us he was getting Youth's Companion in the man, like he's connected to the wider world. He could mark time. Man, would you need to mark time on this island? I think everyone probably needed a calendar. We also have a picture of the sitting room. And I really want you to look at the wall of the sitting room. In addition, you see the curtains, you see more geraniums. This is a beautifully appointed parlor. Look at the rug, look at the painted wooden floors. Look at Blurry Charlie. It's really hard to take exposures of kids because they move and they blur the image. So he couldn't sit still, he was reading his book. But I want you to look at the photographs over the sideboard. And when you zoom in close, there's portraits, there's snapshots, so they keep their family with them, you know, friends near and far. But also, if you super zoom way in, about halfway down, there's a matted photograph of the Mount Desert Rock Island Light Station that Lucy likely took. And while the museum across the street only has her negatives, the Tremont Historical Society, I think, has one of her prints. It's not attributed to her on the website, but this is one of her images. It's inscribed on the back, Willis Dolliver from W.H.C. Dodge, her husband. So she's printing, cutting. You can see the scissors on the bottom. This is how I cut, not quite even. And it was pretty standard to frame these kind of images and to paste them on these cards and then send them off. I think this is what the newspaper, I think this is what Spray is getting from Lillian Robbins too. So we start to get like more and more evidence compiling. And it's really interesting, like there's a short story called Captain White's Assistant that was written by Sarah Warner Brooks in 1900. It takes place on the fictional Munson's Rock, which she describes as, quote, the wildest, bleakest lighthouse station in a savage region of the Maine coast. Sound familiar? It sounds a lot like Mount Desert Rock. And she talks about the fictional home. And I just want to read you just a little tiny piece of it, because this fiction is equally important to us as the photographs and everything else. In its simple interior, a sitting room, 2 bedrooms, and a tiny kitchen radiated that inexpressible atmosphere of home. with feminine domestic genius can alone impart to a human habitation. The bedrooms with their gaily painted chamber, sets, muslin draped looking glasses, billowy feather beds, lace trimmed pillow shams, and somewhat florid drawn rugs were pretty and cozy. The sitting room with its homemade carpet, spotless scrim window draperies, its red covered center table with a well-trimmed lamp was decidedly smart. The addition of a rattan work basket and a highly varnished sewing machine gave the finishing feminine touches to the apartment, while a shelf of blown geraniums and fuchsia on the windowsill idealized the whole. This depiction, she can't just be imagining it. Like, she is describing what the interiors of these remote lighthouse keepers' houses looked like. That staple Maine Coast sweetie, the fried donuts in the kitchen along the chowders. So we can say that their dwellings were typical for people at the time, and that helps us a lot. So if we look at Lucy's visuals, this is my favorite one. This is Gulls from August of 1907. A lot of the written record of the rock talks about how popular it was for gulls. It was a nesting place for gulls as well. This is a gorgeous, very modern, and very difficult to capture photograph, I would argue, because the gulls are not blurred. I mean, she really has them in flight. And also it helps us imagine the sounds. The gulls, the foghorn, the light, the kids. Any written account of the rock talks about the gardens because there is no soil on the island. So in 1896, Scribner's magazine wrote a story about the lighthouse tender Armeria and said, on Mount Desert Rock, there is no soil, save such as has been brought with great labor in barrels from the mainland. With this, a tiny flower garden has been made in a sheltered corner. In it, and in a number of boxes, a few hardy plants bloom brightly and afford a new source of joy with each opening bud. In the windows, too, as is in the case at nearly all the light stations on the coast, a few pots of flowers receive assiduous care. The tiny garden is carefully fenced in to protect it from the flock of fowls that constitute the sole livestock of this rocky farm. Every winter, this dirt would be swept away, and every spring, for decades, the fishermen would haul out barrels of soil so they could make these gardens, like you see in the Newman's tenement, with the kids standing in there in 1907, which is so amazing to me. The 1930s and 1940s, like magazines continue to call it a floral paradise. That seems like a bit of an exaggeration to me. But even a 1934 issue of the U.S. Lighthouse Services Bulletin says, the dirt the fishermen bring off is carefully packed in between the crevices, and seeds of many varieties are sown and tended. Visitors approaching during the summer and early fall are amazed at the kaleidoscope of color that greets the eye on the barrel ledge. Lucy Dodge's visual documentation of this long-standing ritual helps us to understand, like, the extent that these families went to make this home, to make it livable, to make it beautiful, to make it theirs. And you really see that. Also, the kids help for scale. So it's really nice to see Lawrence, Charles's son, standing next to the light. They also get visitors from workers. They got a new kitchen in October of 1908 and a lot of station repair after a storm. You get a sense of the day-to-day life going in and out in the dory and the boat and what the kids would have learned, what people would have worn. And so with these images, we have a record, not just of Lucy's life, but also the lives of these families and the world that they created on this very remote island. William remained a lighthouse keeper until his retirement in 1934. He went to Sigmund Island Light, Egg Rock, Blue Hill Bay, and Islesboro, where he was the last lighthouse keeper at Brindle Point when the Coast Guard took over after he retired. Casper Murphy went on to serve the US Army in World War I. He fell ill in 1919, likely with the Spanish flu. Lucy brought him home to Maine to care for him, and he never left. By 1930, he's living with them in Islesboro. He had become a boat builder and stayed in their household till 1940. The last mention of Lucy Dodge was her very brief Bangor Daily News obituary published on October 8th of 1946, the day after she died at home in Islesboro. Survived by her husband, William Dodge of Islesboro, and by her nephew, Casper I. Murphy. Her funeral was at the Pleasant Hill Cemetery in Tremont, where she was born and raised and then buried. Nothing about her life as a school teacher, nothing about her life on the rock as a lighthouse keeper's wife, nothing about being a photographer in the turn of the century, just that she was and she wasn't. And she was beloved by her husband and her nephew, and that's it. And that's all we had for so many people. And so I think as we close out this evening, and I'll take questions in just a second, I'm not going to talk about these other women photographers. I just want to show you a few images, which will take about 1 minute. I wrote a book with some friends, Earl Shuttleworth and Susan Danley, in 2015 called Maine Photography, a History. And I wrote the chapter about early Maine women photographers. Not even 10 years later, we know so much more. No one had digitized these photos of Lucy Dodge. No one had digitized the photos yet of so many of the women at the Maine Maritime Museum and the Penobscot Marine Museum. If I was to write this again, I would be able to see so much more. But this is Emma Lewis Coleman in York Harbor in the 1880s. Emma Sewell in the Bath region in 1890. Chansonetta Stanley Emmons in Kingfield, Maine. Joanna Colcord taking a pic. This is the best portrait of her father, Link, who was a captain off the Cape of Good Hope in 1900. I think it's hard to photograph on a rock, try this ship. Harriet Hitchborn, the Cape Jellison docks in Stockton Springs. Ruth Montgomery, a self-portrait, watering plants in East Booth Bay. Also women and children swimming. Jo Banks, portraits of children. Abby Minot, her father's shipyard. Lucy Dodge is in the same context of all of these women who have been known about for a long time because they've been rescued literally from the archive. Glass plate negatives are inaccessible until you print or scan them. You can look at them, you can hold them up to the light, you can put them on a light table, but until someone prints them or scans them and puts them in the reverse so you can see them, they're hidden and they're fragile. And a lot of people just threw them away. Oh, these were Aunt so-and-so's. Nobody's keeping these. So this recovery work is so essential to helping us understand not just the lives of women and families, but also the lived social and cultural lives of our ancestors in Maine and beyond. That day-to-day life, which is the hardest thing for any historian to capture, right? We can see who won the elections or lost them. We can see the big major news events. We can see births and deaths and marriages, but this is the in-between. And these images do so much to help us really get the in-between and to take that written record of the dungeon, prison, barren island that no one would ever want to go to and show it as a beautiful home for these keepers and their families. Thank you. I'm happy to take questions. Also, I never get offended when people have to go do other things. So like, don't feel stuck in your chair. But I'm happy to answer any questions if anyone has any. Or if you have secret negatives in your house.
What did they do for fresh water?
What did they do for fresh water? A lot of rain barrels. You can see them in some of the pictures. And, you know, casks of various liquids would have come out too, beer and wine and cider and things, but water is rain barrel. Which is a great question, right? In terms of just the day-to-day life, they eat an inordinate amount of fish. So much fish, so much chowder. But Mrs. Newman's like very snappy newspaper letter was really helpful because it does tell us that the first of every month, at least one of the keepers is going ashore for 10 days and bringing back supplies. So they are getting fresh supplies at least monthly, like in addition to the stuff being thrown off steamers at them and whatever the fishermen are bringing. And I'm assuming that all those people who picnic out there maybe also share, because you're not picnicking out there and not talking to the 3 families who live there. Like part of their job as public relations for the lighthouse service is giving people tours. I mean, if people land on your lighthouse and there's not an emergency going around, you show them around, you walk them everywhere. So they're getting a lot of news that way too. And we know people from those guidebooks that people are going out weekly for picnics. Has anyone in this room been to a picnic on Mount Desert Rock? A couple, all right, see, it still happens. Does it look like the pictures?
Yes.
Is the rock too harsh for there to have been livestock?
There's nothing for them to graze on. There would have been really no way to feed them. I think you get the sense that occasionally they sometimes have some chickens. But even then, it would be so hard to feed them. There's no consistent way. So, and on most, that's, you know, on most of the islands that the lighthouse places that had grass, they absolutely had like sheep and a milk cow. You see that in a lot of records, but not here. So that would have been even more of a challenge to get supplies.
Hi, my name is Osher Johnson. I'm the one that emailed you.
Oh, yay. You have a great letter.
Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you too.
But in that letter from Margaret King, she talked about having chickens.
So and her letter is way earlier than any of these people. So there's 1850s, 60s-ish, like right around the Civil War. Chickens, yes, like cows, no. But on most other ones, yes. Like if you're looking at most of the other lighthouse records on Maine, and you can see like a lot of them kept sheep just to cut the grass. So no one had to do it.
They could keep their sheep and their livestock on other islands.
That makes a lot of
And then
sense
go
too,
over.
and then go over. But even the closest ones are like, what, 10 plus miles away for them? It's a hike. They are dependent a lot on each other. They're also a lot of, you get the sense they had a pretty good library in their houses, you know, to pass those long nights. A lot of reading. You know, you don't get radio out there these people aren't living out there with radio. Yeah, no internet. They're really, cell phone signal probably still doesn't work out there. But they're really dependent on the mail, which I have to imagine caused no amount of joy when that came in. With letters from family, from friends, subscriptions to magazines, newspapers, periodicals. That's how they really kept connected with the world, like that and the visits they were having.
In any of the photographs of any type, did you ever notice when I've sailed by the island, I've just seen like 10,000 seals on the island? Did they ever back then? Is that a new thing?
Oh, that's such a good question. We would have to ask our friends at College of the Atlantic who manage it as a research station now, if there were seals. I see a lot of birds in her images, but not any particular images of seals, which doesn't mean that they weren't there. But I wonder if it's lack of population now. I mean, it is sometimes when there's researchers and things out there, if the seals feel more comfortable coming where there are no people. But that's really interesting. There aren't any photographs of hers with any seals in them, but that doesn't mean that they weren't there. But there were plenty of seagulls.
So I'm kind of from the College of the Atlantic. I'm a facility coordinator of Mount Desert Rock.
There you go. So you will be able to answer that question.
And have been for a number of years. And the seals were never in large numbers. They are in early writings that they would have passed by. They certainly were in college with 2 species that we have common today. But wildlife not in the numbers. So the question about the drinking waters, you would have discouraged gulls at Mount Desert Rock because the water would have been collected from the roofs. And you would not have wanted all of that gull Actually, in the water, there are two large cisterns at Mount Discroft, each hold 1,200 gallons in the duplex house in the basement, with the wooden gutters built into what is very ornate trim. We wouldn't do that today, but 10 Mount Discroft, I can tell you as someone who's trying to keep it there. The gutters were an integral plumbing system to these cisterns, and so they would have collected every drop of water that fell on the roof, and that the attitudes towards other wildlife are not like they are today, and seals are very skittish animals. So the human presence alone would have kept those numbers down.
How long do you spend on there when you go?
Well,
Like, have you slept there many a night?
oh, yes, I led the construction of the current boathouse and what we would call the single keeper's house in modern history. The buildings have redundant lives. Many buildings that were built at Mount Desert Rock are not there anymore. And even in our recent lifetime, in the time that the college has owned it, buildings have been swept away and replaced. So my longest stint was for most of the year from April to late November during those construction periods. But I've been a participant there since the 80s through the college, first with their whale research program and then much later in life. As you know, what I think of as somebody who tries to support that facility for all of us, for in history and in the future. A fascinating talk, a fascinating, wonderful place for me. I can say two things that I was struck at your comment. One was the glass plates, how nothing goes to Mount Discroft without very deliberate intent. And if there is a way to keep it dry, I could see how people can keep it dry, and I can identify firsthand with Lucy and the people that have lived there about how special and how homey it feels when you're above the place looking out. And I think that's a strange thing. Those comments were all looking in from the sea, and it is a formidable scene for sure, but it feels much different when you're ashore.
I love that, looking in and looking out, and I love with deliberate intent. And she really did bring them with deliberate intent. And also it takes some skill. I mean, it's always skill to compose an image, but Kodak is you push a button, we'll do the rest, and you send off the film to be developed. Even film is precious. Glass plate negatives are precious. You overexpose it, you underexpose it. It's hours of your life, like, spent trying to capture this place. And I think it does show an affinity for the place and its people. You wouldn't try to do that just because you were bored. And there absolutely are photographs that people took coming to the island. You can see the ones in the National Archive, but they're very much documentary, right? Here are the buildings, here's the people who are here. Hey, lighthouse keeper boat, but these ones are much more intimate and artful and really trying to show this place's home, which really strikes me. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for being here too. I love when like the past and the present collide, which they always do in the state of Maine. In really wonderful ways.
I noticed there was no pictures or anything on the walls, then I thought, well, storage would knock it off walls, right?
There was a little, the walls are pretty bare and whitewashed, and I don't know how often they're doing that. They do, and this is why I'm so keen. Billy's gonna email me the moment that other interior comes. Maybe it's, and it would, they may not see bedrooms because those were private spaces, and we're seeing more public ones. And I think a kid's bedroom would have been more of a public space, because it would have been like, Casper, come bunk with us. Someone needs to sleep over in the lighthouse, right? So he has a nice bed in a very well-appointed, clean room. And what else are you gonna do? You got time to clean your room. Keep it that way. They have the kind of snapshots you would expect to see in like a late Victorian home, right? Those pictures that were I didn't see a lot of framed pictures. Then you wonder like what kind of needlecraft was going on there too. Knitting, crocheting, perhaps they made the lace that was on the beds. But again, someone's still got to bring out the yarn and all of those other things. So it's, what they had, I think they really took pride of ownership in. But yeah, we don't know, because those are only 2 interiors in 3, 2, but 2 houses in one, 3 fairly substantially sized outbuildings. So I'm hoping we get a little bit more of a window of what's on the inside, because that really shows us more of their lived life. Yeah.
These days, the Sunbeam takes religion out to the outer islands. And I wondered if these families had a service like that?
That's a great, that has been in place, the Sunbeam and those before it, it's been going on for a long time. Certainly since the 20s, 30s, and 40s. I'll have to see if it's earlier. In all of the, Willie, do you know?
Yeah, I can speak to that. So when this show came down, the Heritage Museum is about the Seacoast Mission, and actually, so they were founded in 1905. And there's a reference, I think 1906 or 8, that the vessel then was equipped with 3 or 4 casks of reading materials, which gets back to your point. They go around the coast with reading materials and what have you, yeah. And the Sunbeam was very attuned with lighthouses. My grandmother grew up on one, a different one, and when they moved off, the Sunbeam was sent to meet them.
There's a little bit of a record. So there's the manuals for keepers and assistants and what their duties are like very clearly laid out. It is also clearly laid out that they are allowed to worship on Sunday, but not everyone, even if, especially if they were closer to land or on, but not everyone could go. Someone always had to be at the lighthouse, even if it was a family member who was like deputized to stand in. So I would imagine those weeks when they alternated going off for the month, they would have caught up with church too. But yeah, it would have been the mission. So we know that at least for their time, they could have been out there. One more question?
Yeah, you talked about the images in the glass plate negatives being hidden until their scans are printed. I wonder if you could talk, and you also talked about zooming in on the images above that piece of furniture on the interior shot. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the process of discovery when you have the opportunity to examine these pictures more closely.
Oh yeah, as you know, as a photo historian, I was so excited to be up here and to see these. I don't even need to open the envelopes and see. I mean, I know what the glass plates look like, but to see the boxes, to see her hand was really special. Even this evening when I saw those, you can see the boxes on the way out and like how they would have been kept, which checks out. This is most often how you find them. You go on eBay and you're like 4x5 dry point negatives, you'll get boxes for sale that you can buy and develop someone else's pictures. Depends the resolution that they're scanned in. The process, we have a really sophisticated digitization lab at the Osher Map Library. We digitize in-house all our own things, and I have 2-3 people who work full-time doing this. We photograph them with a camera on a light table. So we actually put the glass plate negative on a light table, photograph it from above at 100 megapixels. We have really sophisticated cameras. So you can digitize, you can zoom in on it hundreds of times to get complete clarity. Not everything is digitized at that resolution. These are digitized at a very high resolution, Willie, because you all have them professionally done, right?
They would have put the light table on camera, and they're full-size files, could be a billboard of Jersey. They're huge. I mean, you could make it.
So it's partially discovery and partially with those interiors, like what I was looking for. And when I saw, I'm like, okay, there's going to be portraits, there's going to be family. I'm not going to know who those are. But when I saw a picture of the lighthouse on the rock that was matted on that card, and we had that newspaper article that says that they're printing on the island, I was like, this is it. Somebody's got to have it. And I searched Dodge and I searched, you know, Mount Desert Brook, and a lot of the Mount Desert Island collections are connected online in a way that many are not, which also make this cross-searching possible. Y'all have a million historical societies and museums and things, which is amazing. But the collections talk to each other. And so even though there's no Lucy Dodge attached that want a Tremont, I'll write them a note so they'll put her name on it. I found it and was like, that's the one on the wall. If it wasn't scanned to that high resolution, I couldn't see it. And unless I'm in, I doubt you guys have a light table across the street, right? You can't do this kind of research in person unless there's a light table. Not everyone has those anymore. It's the same with slides. So that digitization really makes them accessible, discoverable. And this was the most common way of photographing for, 40 years. So it's a lot of time that's covered in that way. And so the more these get found and digitized, the better. The Penobscot Marine Museum has the whole Eastern Illustrated Company archive. They were a real photo postcard place in Belfast. Unreal. There are tens of thousands of glass plate negatives of every town and village in Maine. And it's all digitized and on there, and you can adopt a town and help them do the work. There's a really beautiful book that they produced a couple of years ago called Maine on Glass. That is a real nice window into these images. So more and more to discover, but more seeing like what women are taking pictures of and how so many women are doing this work. You have to imagine that it's more than just a passing hobby for folks. And so I encourage you to look at home and in attics and things and see what you find in wooden boxes. And if the things look like that, they're glass plate negatives. I am happy to hang around and chat with anyone who has more questions, but I will also let everyone escape into this beautiful evening. Thank you so much for coming.